The morning sun streamed through the windows of the airport terminal as Diane Reynolds made her way to Gate 23. She pulled her small carry-on behind her, the wheels clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. At 58, Diane moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime making quick decisions under pressure, though no one would guess that by looking at her now. She wore a simple navy cardigan over a white blouse, comfortable slacks, and sensible shoes, the uniform of countless travelers passing through Dallas-Fort Worth International that Tuesday morning. Her silver-streaked hair was gathered in a practical low ponytail, and reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was anything but an ordinary woman, heading to visit family or perhaps taking a business trip. The gate agent scanned her boarding pass with a smile. "Enjoy your flight to Washington, Colonel." Diane nodded politely, though she felt the familiar twinge whenever someone used her former rank. It had been 3 years since her retirement from the Air Force, and sometimes she still woke up expecting to put on her uniform. "Just Diane is fine," she said with a small smile. "Those days are behind me now." The agent looked momentarily embarrassed. "Of course, Ms. Reynolds, have a pleasant flight." As Diane joined the line of passengers filing onto the aircraft, she took note of everything around her, a habit from decades of training that she couldn't shake. The flight attendant greeting passengers at the door. The cockpit door slightly ajar where the captain was reviewing final checks. The mood of her fellow travelers, a mix of business people typing last-minute emails and families corralling excited children. Once on board, she easily found her seat. 12F, a window spot over the wing. She preferred wing seats. They offered the smoothest ride and the best view of the aircraft's mechanics. She stowed her bag, settled into her seat, and pulled out a well-worn paperback mystery novel, though her mind wasn't really on reading. This trip to Washington wasn't entirely personal. 3 years into civilian life, and she was still being called in for consultations. The Department of Defense had requested her presence for a review of certain protocols she had helped develop during her final years of service. Protocols involving civilian aircraft communications during certain types of emergencies. "Can I get you something to drink before takeoff?" Diane looked up to see a flight attendant smiling down at her. "Just water, please," she replied, accepting the small plastic cup. The flight attendant moved on, and Diane returned to her thoughts. The seat next to her remained empty as the boarding process continued. Diane silently hoped it would stay that way. She wasn't in the mood for small talk. She wanted time to prepare mentally for the meetings ahead. No such luck. A breathless young man arrived just as the final boarding announcements were being made. "Sorry." "Excuse me, I think that's my seat," he said, pointing to the middle spot next to her. Diane nodded and shifted slightly to make room. The young man, who introduced himself as Tyler, immediately pulled out a laptop covered in stickers from tech conferences and began typing furiously. "Big deadline," he explained, though she hadn't asked. "I'm building an app that helps people find parking in big cities. You know how impossible parking can be in DC, right?" Diane murmured noncommittally, opening her book to signal her preference for quiet. The flight attendants performed their safety demonstration, and Diane found herself mentally filling in the gaps of their abbreviated instructions. In her career, she had helped rewrite some of the emergency protocols they were glossing over. Few passengers realized how much thought went into those procedures, how many simulations and real-world scenarios had been analyzed to create the simplified instructions being demonstrated now. The plane pushed back from the gate and taxied toward the runway. Diane felt the familiar tension in her shoulders ease as the engines revved and the aircraft accelerated down the runway. No matter how many thousands of hours she had logged in military aircraft, there was still something remarkable about the moment when tons of metal defied gravity and lifted into the air. As they climbed to cruising altitude, Diane gazed out at the landscape below, watching as highways became thin lines and buildings shrank to miniature models. The Texas landscape gave way to the patchwork quilt of farmland. It would be a 2-hour and 40-minute flight to Reagan National, barring any weather delays. Tyler had thankfully become absorbed in his work, leaving Diane to her thoughts. She tried to focus on her book, but after reading the same paragraph 3 times, she gave up and tucked it back into the seat pocket. Instead, she pulled out the briefing papers she'd been sent, disguised in a plain manila folder that wouldn't attract attention. The technical language in the documents transported her back to the world she'd left. A world of classified intelligence, tactical decisions, and lives hanging in the balance. Though she had commanded fighter squadrons and later helped design emergency response systems, Diane had never sought the spotlight. She preferred working behind the scenes, solving complex problems that others didn't even know existed. Her thoughts drifted to her last active mission, the one that had ultimately led to her decision to retire. A routine training exercise had turned critical when communication systems failed unexpectedly. She had been forced to rely on visual signals, old-school methods that younger pilots barely remembered from their training. Her knowledge of those nearly forgotten protocols had prevented disaster that day. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude of 32,000 feet, the captain's voice announced over the intercom, interrupting her memories. "Weather looks good all the way to Washington, and we should be arriving right on schedule. The flight attendants will be coming through with beverage service shortly." Diane accepted a coffee when the cart came by, sipping it slowly as she continued reviewing her documents. The familiar blend of technical specifications and procedural guidelines was oddly comforting. This was a language she understood perfectly, clear, precise, leaving no room for misinterpretation. An hour into the flight, she noticed something through her window that caught her professional attention. Another aircraft far in the distance, moving in a pattern that seemed intentional rather than the standard air traffic routes she was accustomed to seeing. Most passengers wouldn't notice, or if they did, wouldn't think twice about it. But Diane wasn't most passengers. She watched the distant aircraft for several minutes, noting its heading and altitude relative to their own. Probably nothing, she told herself. Just another flight on another route. The skies were busy places, especially approaching the eastern seaboard. Still, something about the flight pattern nagged at her. She had spent too many years monitoring aircraft behavior to dismiss the feeling entirely. The way the distant plane moved reminded her of certain military maneuvers, not aggressive ones, but definitely purposeful. She took a sip of her now cold coffee and tried to refocus on her paperwork. The young man beside her had finally stopped typing and was now watching a movie on his laptop, the glow illuminating his face in the dimmed cabin. Most of the other passengers had settled into the routine of mid-flight boredom, some sleeping, others working or entertaining themselves with books or devices. The cabin had that peculiar hush that comes when dozens of strangers find themselves sharing the liminal space between departure and arrival. Diane glanced out the window again. The aircraft she had noticed earlier was gone, but now there was something else, or rather things. 3 distinct objects moving with precision that no commercial flight could match. Her heart rate quickened slightly, though her expression remained calm. Military aircraft. And not just any military aircraft. From the glimpse she caught, these were almost certainly F-22 Raptors, the most advanced fighters in the American arsenal. No one else seemed to have noticed yet. The flight attendants continued their service, passengers remained absorbed in their activities, and the captain had made no announcement about the fighter escort, because that's what this was, an escort. But why? Fighter escorts for civilian aircraft were extremely rare, typically reserved for suspected terrorist threats or serious mechanical issues that might endanger populations on the ground. Diane carefully folded her papers and returned them to her bag. 3 decades of military discipline kept her face neutral, but her mind was racing through possibilities. Something was happening, something significant enough to scramble those fighters. And as the lead F-22 moved into a position more visible from her window, Diane realized this was no ordinary escort protocol. The fighters were trying to communicate something, using patterns that few people would recognize, patterns that she had helped create. The world around her, the drone of the engines, the murmur of passengers, even the young tech developer beside her, all faded into the background. In that moment, Diane Reynolds wasn't just another passenger in seat 12F. She was Colonel Reynolds again, and something told her that before this flight landed, everyone on board would know it. The first passenger to notice the fighter jets was a little boy sitting 3 rows behind Diane. "Mom, look! Fighter planes." His excited voice cut through the cabin's quiet hum, heads turned toward windows on the right side of the aircraft. Phones appeared in hands as people tried to capture images of the sleek gray F-22 Raptors, now clearly visible against the blue sky. Diane kept her eyes fixed on the lead fighter. Its positioning wasn't random. The slight banking motion, the distance it maintained, these were intentional signals. To most observers, the jets might appear to be simply flying alongside the commercial aircraft, perhaps as part of a training exercise. But Diane recognized the pattern from protocols she had helped develop years ago. The fighters were trying to communicate something specific, and they were using visual cues designed for situations when radio communication wasn't possible or secure. A flight attendant's voice came over the intercom, her professional calm barely masking concern. "Ladies and gentlemen, as some of you have noticed, we have military aircraft in our vicinity. This is not a cause for alarm. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened as a precaution." Murmurs rippled through the cabin. A businessman across the aisle from Diane pulled out his phone and began frantically texting. An elderly couple held hands, their knuckles white with tension. The young tech developer next to her, Tyler, closed his laptop and pressed his face against the middle seat window, trying to get a glimpse of the jets. "Why are they flying with us?" He asked no one in particular. "Is something wrong with our plane?" Diane didn't answer. Her attention was focused on the lead fighter's movements. There was a pattern forming, a specific sequence of positions that carried meaning to those trained to interpret it. 3 quick banking motions followed by a sustained position slightly above their altitude. Then another series of subtle adjustments. The captain's voice came over the intercom next, steady but tense. "This is Captain Wilson speaking. We've been advised by air traffic control that these aircraft will be escorting us for a portion of our journey. I want to assure everyone that our aircraft is functioning normally, and we're in communication with the appropriate authorities. We'll update you as we receive more information." But Diane knew the captain wasn't telling the whole story. The patterns the fighters were flying suggested communication difficulties, possibly a security concern that required visual rather than verbal confirmation. "I've never seen anything like this," Tyler whispered, his earlier enthusiasm about his parking app forgotten. "Do you think it's some kind of threat? Like terrorism or something?" "It's not necessarily that dramatic," Diane replied, keeping her voice low and steady. "There are many reasons military aircraft might escort a civilian flight." But even as she said it, she knew this was no routine escort. The fighters were actively trying to communicate using a code few. People would recognize a code specifically designed for high-ranking military personnel who might be traveling on civilian aircraft during certain types of security situations. The lead F-22 banked sharply and positioned itself where its pilot would have a clear view into the passenger windows. It was looking for someone who would understand. "They're trying to talk to us," a woman said from across the aisle, holding up her phone. "It's all over social media already. People are saying there's a bomb threat or something. Please put your phone away," a flight attendant said firmly as she moved through the cabin. "We need everyone to remain calm and seated." Diane watched as the lead fighter adjusted position again, repeating the same pattern she had noticed earlier. 3 banking motions followed by a specific altitude adjustment, then a new pattern, one that made her breath catch slightly. The fighter was using an identification request signal. It was looking for someone with clearance to acknowledge and respond. She glanced around the cabin. The other passengers were growing increasingly anxious. A child was crying softly a few rows ahead. Flight attendants moved through the aisle, offering reassurances they themselves didn't fully believe. Diane made her decision. She pressed the call button. When the flight attendant arrived, Diane spoke quietly but with unmistakable authority. "I need to speak with the captain immediately. My name is Colonel Diane Reynolds, United States Air Force, retired. Those fighters are using visual communication protocols that I helped develop. They're trying to convey specific information, and I can interpret it." The flight attendant looked skeptical, but something in Diane's tone, the calm certainty of someone used to command, made her hesitate. "Ma'am, the captain is busy managing the situation." "That's exactly why he needs to speak with me," Diane interrupted. "Those fighters aren't just escorting us. They're trying to communicate something specific, and I'm trained to understand what they're saying." The flight attendant's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing genuine worry. "I'll let him know," she said after a moment. "Please stay in your seat." As the attendant made her way to the cockpit, Diane returned her attention to the window. The fighters had adjusted formation again. Now 2 were visible from her side, with presumably the third on the opposite side of the aircraft. Their positioning confirmed what she already suspected. This was a full security escort, not just a precautionary measure. Tyler was watching her with new interest. "You're military?" he asked. Diane corrected. "Air Force, retired 3 years ago. And you know what those planes are doing?" She nodded slightly but offered no further explanation. Her focus remained on the aircraft outside, reading their movements like a language only she understood. The lead fighter was now signaling something new. 5 quick altitude adjustments followed by a specific positioning relative to the commercial aircraft's wing. Diane's expression remained neutral, but internally her concern deepened. That particular signal indicated a potential security threat at their destination, not on the aircraft itself, but at Reagan National Airport where they were scheduled to land. The flight attendant returned, looking more unsettled than before. "The captain would like to know what information you can provide about the fighter's movements. Tell him they're signaling a security situation at our destination airport. Not on this aircraft," Diane said quietly. "They're requesting diversion to an alternate landing site. I need to respond to confirm receipt of their message." "I can do that using reflected light." The attendant's eyes widened slightly. "You can signal to them? How?" "I need a small mirror and directed light," Diane explained. "A compact mirror would work, and my reading light here can provide the light source." The flight attendant hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I'll see what I can find, and I'll tell the captain what you said." As the attendant hurried away, Diane felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders again. A familiar feeling she hadn't experienced since retirement. Around her, the other passengers continued to speculate nervously, unaware that the person who might hold the key to understanding their situation was sitting quietly in seat 12F. The flight attendant returned minutes later with a small compact mirror and leaned close to Diane. "The captain says he's received communication from air traffic control about a security situation at Reagan. They've been instructed to divert to Andrews Air Force Base, but communication has been spotty. He wants to know if you can confirm this is what the fighters are indicating." Diane nodded. "Yes, that's consistent with their signals. And I can confirm receipt to let them know we understand." She took the compact mirror and angled her reading light. With precise movements honed from years of training, Diane began reflecting light toward the lead fighter in a specific pattern. 3 short flashes, a pause, 2 long flashes, another pause, then 4 short flashes. It was a simple acknowledgement code, but embedded within it was her military identification code, a sequence that would tell the fighter pilots exactly who was sending the signal. The lead F-22 immediately adjusted its position in response, a clear confirmation that the message had been received and understood. "They've acknowledged," Diane said to the flight attendant. "Tell the captain they understand we're diverting to Andrews." As the attendant returned to the cockpit, Diane noticed Tyler staring at her with a mix of confusion and awe. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. Diane gave him a small, tired smile. "Just someone who remembers her training." The captain's voice came over the intercom again, steadier now. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a security situation at Reagan National Airport, we've been instructed to divert to Andrews Air Force Base. I want to assure everyone that our aircraft is secure, and this diversion is precautionary. We'll be landing in approximately 45 minutes. Please continue to follow all crew instructions." Outside the window, the fighters adjusted their formation again, moving into standard escort positions now that communication had been established. Diane leaned back in her seat, feeling a flood of memories washing over her. How many times had she been on the other side of this scenario, piloting fighters alongside vulnerable aircraft, responsible for their safe passage through troubled skies? Now she was just a passenger. Except she wasn't, not really. Not when her training and experience still lived inside her, ready to be called upon when needed. The plane banked gently, changing course for Andrews Air Force Base. The F-22s adjusted with it, maintaining their protective formation. And in seat 12F, Colonel Diane Reynolds watched the clouds drift below, knowing this flight was far from over. Word spread quickly through the cabin. Whispers traveled from row to row as passengers shared theories about why fighter jets were escorting their plane and why they were being diverted to an Air Force base instead of landing at Reagan National. "There's a military officer on board. Who's talking to those fighters?" a woman in the row behind, Diane said to her seatmate, her voice carrying just enough for Diane to overhear. Diane kept her eyes forward, maintaining her composure. She didn't want attention. but she knew it was inevitable now. Several passengers were openly watching her, having noticed her use of the mirror to signal the fighters. The head flight attendant approached and leaned down next to Diane's seat. "Colonel Reynolds, the captain has asked if you'd be willing to come to the cockpit. He'd like to speak with you directly." Diane nodded and unbuckled her seatbelt. As she stood, she felt dozens of eyes following her movement down the aisle. The weight of their stares reminded her of her first day as a squadron commander, that same mix of curiosity, hope, and uncertainty. "Will we be okay?" a young woman asked as Diane passed her seat, reaching out to touch her arm. Diane paused and looked directly at her. "Yes," she said simply with the quiet confidence that had steadied nervous pilots under her command for decades. "This is precautionary. The fighters are here to ensure our safety," the woman nodded, visibly relaxing at Diane's assured tone. The flight attendant led her to the cockpit door, knocked with a specific pattern, and the door opened. The space inside was tight, filled with instruments and screens that glowed with data. The captain, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, glanced up from the controls. His co-pilot, a younger woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, maintained her focus on the instruments but nodded in acknowledgement. "Colonel Reynolds," the captain said, offering his hand. "Captain Stephen Parker. Thank you for your assistance. These aren't conditions I've encountered before." Diane shook his hand. "I understand. Have you received any further communications from air traffic control?" "Sporadic," Captain Parker replied, gesturing to the radio. "We're getting interference on several frequencies. Andrews has confirmed they're expecting us, but details about the nature of the security situation are unclear." "The fighters indicated something to you?" "Yes," Diane said, leaning slightly to look out the cockpit window where 2 of the F-22s were visible. "They're using a visual communication protocol developed for situations where standard communications might be compromised. The pattern they're flying indicates a security threat at our original destination, not a direct threat to this aircraft." The co-pilot looked up at that. "That matches what little we've gotten from Andrews. Apparently there's some kind of security situation at Reagan National. They're diverting all incoming flights." Diane watched as the fighters adjusted their position again. "They're indicating we should maintain current heading and speed," she translated. "They'll continue escort to Andrews." Captain Parker studied her for a moment. "You can really read all that from their flight patterns?" "It's a simplified visual language," Diane explained. "Developed for precisely this kind of situation, where electronic communications might be unreliable or compromised. I was part of the team that created the protocol about 15 years ago." The captain nodded slowly. "And they recognized your response?" "Yes, I included my identification code in the light signals. They know exactly who they're communicating with now." The co-pilot glanced at Diane with new respect. "That explains the change in their formation after you signaled them." A burst of static came through the radio, followed by a partial transmission. "Andrews Tower to Flight 237. Prepare for priority landing. Security personnel will, upon arrival." The rest was lost to interference, but Captain Parker acknowledged the transmission. "Roger, Andrews Tower, priority landing understood. Awaiting further instructions." He turned to Diane. "Colonel, I'd appreciate it if you could continue to interpret the fighters' signals. Our normal communication channels are unreliable at best right now." "Of course," Diane agreed, "though I think the passengers would benefit from more information. Fear thrives in uncertainty." Captain Parker considered this, then nodded. "You're right. Would you be willing to address them? Coming from you, someone who understands what's happening and has military experience, it might be more reassuring." Diane hadn't expected this request, but she understood the reasoning. "Yes, I can do that. Thank you." Captain Parker reached for the intercom. "I'll introduce you." Moments later, Diane found herself standing at the front of the cabin, holding the intercom handset as all eyes focused on her. She felt a familiar calm settle over her, the same steady focus that had carried her through combat missions and crisis situations throughout her career. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice clear and measured. "I'm Colonel Diane Reynolds, United States Air Force, retired. I want to share what we know about our current situation." She paused, looking at the faces watching her. Business people, families, elderly couples, all united now by this unexpected turn in their journey. The fighter jets accompanying us are providing a standard security escort. They're not here because of any threat to this aircraft. Rather, there appears to be a security situation at Reagan National Airport, which is why we're being diverted to Andrews Air Force Base. She could see the tension in some faces begin to ease. I've been in communication with these pilots using visual signals, a protocol developed for situations when normal communications might be unreliable. They're indicating that we should continue on our current course to Andrews, where we'll land safely. They'll stay with us the entire way. A hand raised from the middle of the cabin. Why can't the pilots just radio each other? A man asked. There appears to be some interference affecting normal communications channels, Diane explained. This could be related to the security situation, or it could be technical issues. The visual communication system we're using was developed specifically as a backup for situations like this. Another passenger called out, "Are we in danger?" Diane shook her head. No, the diversion is precautionary. In fact, having fighter escorts is one of the safest positions a civilian aircraft can be in. She offered a small, reassuring smile. I've been on both sides of this situation, both as a fighter pilot providing escort and now as a passenger. I can tell you that those pilots outside take their protection duty very seriously. She could see her words having the desired effect as shoulders relaxed and worried expressions softened around the cabin. Even the flight attendants, who had been maintaining professional composure despite their own concerns, appeared more at ease. We'll be landing at Andrews in about 30 minutes, she continued. There will likely be security personnel meeting the aircraft, which is standard procedure. They'll provide further guidance once we're on the ground. Tyler, still sitting in seat 12B, called out, "How did they know you were on this flight? Did they specifically find our plane because you were on it?" The question caught Diane slightly off guard. It was perceptive and complicated. No, she answered truthfully. They didn't know I was aboard. They were dispatched to escort this flight because of the situation at Reagan. The visual signals they were using are recognizable to certain military personnel who might be traveling on civilian aircraft. I happened to be one of those people. A flight attendant approached and handed Diane a note from the captain. She read it quickly and returned to addressing the cabin. We've received confirmation that we're cleared for priority landing at Andrews. The fighters will continue to escort us until we're safely on the ground. As if on cue, the lead F-22 banked slightly and moved into a new position. Diane watched its movements, reading the message. They're confirming that Andrews is secure and ready for our arrival, she translated, not mentioning the additional details the fighter had conveyed about heightened security measures awaiting them. She handed the intercom back to the flight attendant and made her way back to her seat, nodding reassuringly to passengers as she passed. The atmosphere in the cabin had changed. There was still tension, but the panic had subsided. People were talking in normal tones now, some even managing nervous laughter. As Diane settled back into seat 12F, Tyler looked at her with new eyes. That was impressive, he said. You made everyone feel safer just by explaining things. Diane shrugged slightly. Information is powerful. People can handle difficult situations better when they understand what's happening. Outside her window, the F-22s maintained their protective formation, sleek and deadly against the afternoon sky. One of them adjusted position slightly, and Diane read the subtle movement. They were beginning their approach to Andrews. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Andrews Air Force Base. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Flight attendants, prepare for landing. As the aircraft banked gently and began to descend, Diane felt the familiar pre-landing sensations. The slight decrease in altitude, the change in engine pitch, the subtle shifts in pressure. But unlike the other passengers, she also understood the precise choreography taking place outside, as the fighter pilots adjusted their escort pattern for the landing approach. They were almost there, but Diane knew from experience that sometimes the most critical moment in any mission came just before reaching the destination. She watched the lead fighter intently as they descended through the clouds, reading its movements for any sign of new information, and then she saw it, a subtle but unmistakable change in pattern that sent a chill down her spine. The lead fighter's new pattern was unmistakable. 3 quick rolls followed by a sharp ascent and return to position. In the visual communication system Diane had helped develop, this was an urgent warning. Ground situation escalating. Without hesitation, Diane pressed the flight attendant call button. When the attendant arrived, she spoke quietly but firmly. "I need to speak to the captain. Again, immediately, something." In her tone must have conveyed the urgency because the flight attendant nodded without question and hurried toward the cockpit. Moments later, she returned. "The captain asks if you can tell him what you've observed." "The fighters are signaling that the situation at Andrews has escalated," Diane explained, keeping her voice low to avoid alarming nearby passengers. "Tell him we need to hold position and await further instructions before continuing our approach." As the attendant rushed back to relay her message, Tyler looked at Diane with growing concern. "What's happening?" he whispered. "A change in plans," Diane replied simply, her eyes returning to the window. The plane's descent slowed, then stopped altogether. They leveled off, maintaining altitude instead of continuing down toward Andrews. The captain's voice came over the intercom, remarkably steady despite the circumstances. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're temporarily holding at our current altitude. We expect to resume our approach shortly. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." Murmurs of concern rippled through the cabin. The brief calm Diane had established with her earlier explanation was beginning to fray. She could see it in the tense shoulders, the worried glances, the way parents pulled their children closer. Outside, the F-22s had shifted into a new formation, one fighter ahead, two flanking the commercial aircraft on either side. They were in a protective stance now, creating a buffer between the civilian plane and whatever might be happening on the ground. Diane's mind raced through possibilities. The security situation at Reagan National could have spread to Andrews. Or perhaps new intelligence had led to heightened security measures. Either way, the fighters were clearly indicating they should wait. The flight attendant returned to Diane's side. "The captain would like you to come to the cockpit again. He's received partial communications from Andrews but needs your help interpreting the fighters' signals." Diane nodded and once again made her way to the front of the plane, feeling the weight of passenger gazes on her back. In the cockpit, Captain Parker's expression was tense, but his hands were steady on the controls. "Colonel," he greeted her, "we've received a broken transmission from Andrews telling us to hold position. Can you confirm that's what the fighters are indicating as well?" Diane looked through the cockpit window at the lead F-22. "Yes. They're signaling that the ground situation has escalated. We should maintain current altitude and position until they indicate otherwise." The co-pilot pointed to a radar screen. "We're picking up increased air traffic in the area. More military aircraft." Diane leaned closer to the window, studying the lead fighter's movements. It had adjusted position again and was now executing a new series of maneuvers, more complex than before. "They're indicating a change in destination," she translated, watching intently. "Not Andrews anymore. Where then?" Captain Parker asked. The fighter completed its pattern and Diane understood. "Langley Air Force Base. They want us to divert to Langley." Captain Parker exchanged a glance with his co-pilot. "Langley? That's all the way down in Hampton, Virginia. We don't have enough fuel for that kind of diversion." Diane continued to watch the fighter, which was now repeating the pattern. "They're insistent. Something significant must have happened at Andrews." As if in response to her words, the radio crackled to life with a clearer transmission than they'd heard previously. "Flight 237. This is Andrews Tower. Be advised, we have a security lockdown in progress. Divert to alternate landing site. Repeat, divert to alternate landing site." The transmission cut off, but the message was clear. Captain Parker looked at Diane. "We need to tell them about our fuel situation." Diane nodded and moved closer to the window. Using the cockpit's stronger light sources and her hands to create shadows and reflections, she began signaling to the lead fighter. Her movements were precise, practiced despite years away from active duty. She conveyed their fuel limitations and requested a closer alternate landing site. The fighter responded almost immediately, banking sharply, then leveling out in a pattern that indicated understanding. It then executed a new series of movements. "They're directing us to Joint Base Anacostia Bowling," Diane interpreted. "It's closer to our current position, just south of where Reagan National would have been. We should have enough fuel to reach it." Captain Parker nodded and began adjusting their course. "Anacostia Bowling it is. At least they have facilities for civilian passengers." He turned to the co-pilot. "Alert the cabin crew about our new destination. Let's keep the announcement simple. just that we're diverting to another military facility due to the situation at Andrews. As the co-pilot relayed the instructions, Diane continued watching the fighters. They had adjusted to match the plane's new heading, maintaining their protective formation. "Colonel," Captain Parker said as he stabilized their new course, "I'd like you to stay up here with us until we land, if you don't mind. Your ability to communicate with our escort is invaluable right now." "Of course," Diane agreed, taking the jump seat behind the pilots. The captain activated the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a security situation at Andrews Air Force Base, we're now being diverted to Joint Base Anacostia Bowling, which is equipped to handle civilian aircraft. Our fighter escort will continue to accompany us. We expect to land in approximately 20 minutes. As he finished the announcement, the radio crackled again. A new voice, military rather than air traffic control, came through with remarkable clarity. "Flight 237, this is Colonel Henderson, Air Combat Command. We understand you have Colonel Diane Reynolds on board. Please confirm." Captain Parker looked at Diane in surprise, then responded, "Affirmative. Colonel Reynolds is currently in the cockpit with us. Put her on, please," the voice requested. Captain Parker handed Diane the radio. She took a deep breath before speaking. "This is Colonel Reynolds. Diane," the voice softened slightly, becoming more personal. "It's Jack Henderson. Didn't expect to find you in the middle of this situation." Diane recognized the name immediately, a former colleague she'd worked with on joint exercises years ago. "Likewise, Jack. What can you tell me about what we're flying into?" "Not much over open channels," Henderson replied carefully. "But your escort commander recognized your old identification code in the light signals. When they reported it up the chain, several of us put the pieces together. Your timing couldn't be better. We could use your expertise when you land." Diane frowned slightly. "I've been retired for 3 years, Jack. But you wrote half the protocols we're using right now," Henderson countered. "And you're already involved since you're on that plane. We have a situation that's evolving quickly. Having someone of your experience on the ground will be valuable." Captain Parker was watching her with raised eyebrows. Diane met his gaze and gave a small nod of reassurance before responding to Henderson. "Understood. I'll help however I can." "Good." Henderson's voice was all business again. "Your aircraft will be met by security personnel. They'll escort you and the other passengers to a secure holding area. I'll find you there." The transmission ended, and Captain Parker looked at Diane questioningly. "Should I be concerned that they seem very interested in having you there?" Diane shook her head. "No, Henderson is solid. If they need help with protocol implementation during whatever this security situation is, it makes sense they'd want to pull in someone familiar with the systems." The co-pilot spoke up. "We're beginning our approach to Anacostia Bowling. Our escort is adjusting formation. Outside, the F-22s were indeed shifting into landing approach formation, 2 falling back while the lead maintained position just ahead of them. They're confirming the airspace is secure," Diane noted, watching their movements. As they descended through the clouds, the sprawl of Washington, D.C. came into view, though from a different angle than passengers would normally see when landing at Reagan National. The Potomac River glinted in the afternoon sun, and the Washington Monument stood tall in the distance. But Diane's attention was on the military base they were approaching. Even from the air, she could see increased activity. Military vehicles moving on the ground, personnel gathered near the runways, a level of readiness that spoke to the seriousness of whatever situation was unfolding.